will brief on a new report that's being launched today.
Thank you so much, my dear friend. And it's so great to be back here again and to see so many of you. I'm very excited to share good news, but also to remind everyone to whom you convey your news updates that we still have a long way to go, but it is possible. And this is what this report shows us. Today, Education Cannot Wait, which is the United Nations Global Fund for Education in Emergencies and Protracted Crises, we are launching our annual report titled With Hope and Courage, Moving Fast Forward onto our next strategic plan. And I want to stress that all that is in this report is the result of joint programming across the UN system and among civil society and member states, both as donors and host governments and private sector, precisely as outlined in the United Nations Secretary General's reform, joint programming, working together, the new way of working. This is what it looks like, and it works. So as the world commemorates the International Literacy Day today, we must ensure more than ever that children and adolescents who are suffering from armed conflicts, look at Ukraine, look at Sudan, look at Syria, Yemen, and across sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, that children suffering from armed conflict, those suffering from forced displacement, either as refugees crossing an international boundary or internal displaced, and they amount to about 108 million today of forced displaced populations. And, which is very important, as we have seen more than ever lately, those affected by climate-induced disasters. We are seeing more and more of the impact on education that this tragedy and catastrophic developments have. So when Education Cannot Wait was created, the estimated number of children and adolescents suffering from these catastrophes, these abnormal circumstances, were estimated as 75 million. Today, the latest figures coming from Education Cannot Wait's analysis and endorsed by UN agencies and civil society expert panels amount to 224 million. We are speaking about almost 250 million children and adolescents. Now, the funding asks for education in emergencies and protracted crises have nearly tripled from 1.1 billion in 2019 to almost 3 billion at the end of 2022. And in 2022, the last year, which this report covers, only 30% of the funding requirements were met. And here we have to remember how important is education. Yes, it is Sustainable Development Goal 4, but it's also the foundation for all other Sustainable Development Goals. A nation that is illiterate can never recover from war or conflict or manage climate change, cannot end extreme poverty or provide basic services such as health. And if girls don't go to school, like in Afghanistan today, when it comes to secondary school and upwards, can never achieve gender equality, and certainly not recover and rebuild and build back better. So we are pleased with the report. I want to show it again, because it brings hope, provided that you have the courage to invest in education for children in crisis and conflicts. It provides what can be done when we all come together in the UN system, among civil society, also part of the broader UN system, and member states, and private sector, and foundation, and the media that plays such an instrumental role. It works. We have, since the establishment, as this report will show, of Education Cannot Wait in 2017, reached nearly 9 million children and adolescents with a full-blown quality education. So it's not just about just having a book or a pen or sitting before an empty desk. They receive academic learning, social emotional learning, psychosocial services and mental health, water and sanitation, protection, infrastructure. Teachers receive mental health, psychosocial services, and teacher training, school meals. You pull all of this together, and they have received an education that resembles what we have received. Nearly 9 million, because the entire international community came together through a pooled funding mechanism. And you will see that from the report. Now, while we have reached 9 million, we should still remember there are 224 million out there. And for education cannot wait. And we work closely with our implementing partners, host governments, agencies such as UNICEF, UNESCO, UNHCR, World Food Programme, UNDP, civil society, like Save the Children, Plan International, International Rescue Committee, Norwegian Refugee Council, Jesuit Refugee Service, and massive amount of local national NGOs, and then host governments. We have made investments in 44 crisis-ridden countries. We have an excellent coordination system in place under the resident and humanitarian coordinator, which is a long-standing coordination system established by the United Nations, been there for decades, and which enables us to work from both the humanitarian development perspective, what we call the humanitarian development nexus, to bring all actors together through joint programs. So through this, we have reached 9 million, but the funding is still missing. To reach another 20 million children and adolescents in the coming years, from Afghanistan to Mali, Burkina Faso, South Sudan, the regional refugee crisis in Egypt, Chad, Ethiopia, Central African Republic or South Sudan, across the Sahel, the Venezuelan refugees in Latin America, the children and adolescents affected by climate-induced disasters in the Horn of Africa or in Pakistan. We have the coordination systems in place, but if we had more funding, we could help more than 20 million. But if we aim at 20 million, we have so far raised about $830 million, and we need an additional 670. If we can mobilize another $670 million, we will definitely reach 20 million children by the end of 2026. Last year alone, we reached 4.6 million. It shows the speed with which we can operate when we all work together and use the existing system and coordination structures that are in place. In our new strategy that builds on all our lessons learned and best practices and the actual needs on the ground, we focus on the holistic learning, child-centered approach. That means all the different needs that I have mentioned, water, sanitation, academic learning, and so forth. Also to make sure that we transform the global financing data. We need to understand the data. How many children? What are their needs? What are the costs? And here I would like to remind everyone that in OECD DAC countries, an estimated cost for a child to go to school is about $10,000 a year. We are moving around with the funding we receive with about $150 per child. These are severe socioeconomic inequities. We are focusing on climate change, and I would call out to the climate change community. Climate change is a serious danger to all of us, but we also have to deal with the consequences of it. In Pakistan alone, due to the floods, 22,000 schools were either damaged or destroyed. Just like we have to deal with the consequences of war until we achieve peace, since education cannot wait, climate change investments need to go towards a basic service like education. And on top of it, ensure that curriculum and the next generation have been equipped to deal with climate change so they can bring an end to it or mitigate it. I would also like to call upon all of you to follow our big campaign launched by the United Nations Special Envoy, Global Envoy for Education, Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, which is called Afghan Girls' Voices. Postcards from the Edge. Follow us on social media and read their stories coming from inside Afghanistan, what it feels like to be a teenage girl unable to go to school. Some examples coming from this report, and I'll be very fast on that one, but just to give you some illustrations. In Uganda, where we have a big multi-year humanitarian development nexus program, has resulted in 73% of students have moved up one grade in math and 72% in reading. So we are seeing real learning outcomes. But again, as always, as a global fund, we don't implement. We are a catalyst. We bring everyone together, we mobilize the funds, and then share them for our colleagues and governments who are struggling on the ground. We call for additional funding, high net worth individuals, private sector, member states. And also to remind everyone that the focus on forced displacement is of critical importance, since we reached over 100 million of them today, over 50% being school-age children. I was recently in Chad. I saw the Sudanese refugees fleeing from Darfur across the border. I saw firsthand Darfur across the river. I saw the UN agencies, UNHCR working hand in hand with civil society and the government of Chad 24/7 to receive and live among the fleeing refugee children that amount to 80% together with their mothers, receiving water, sanitation, which is basic, but also a quick support to enroll in education, to continue to bring hope and to maintain, sustain, and empower them and their courage. Hope and courage is theirs. Let us be inspired by them. I think I will end here. I usually have very long talking points, but I would like to open for questions. Thank you so much.
Great. I'll open the floor to questions. First question goes to Edie Lederer.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. You talked about helping 9 million with quality education, but there are 224 million who need it. And if you're only going to be able to reach 20 million by the end of 2026, and that's going to cost $670 million more, how long is it going to take to reach the 224 million, and what is that going to cost? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should I take that question? I am so glad that you asked that question. This is something we always discuss at Education Cannot Wait. If we were to receive 20 times the funding that we are asking for, if we were to receive, instead of receiving 1.5 billion to reach 20 million, and instead would receive 4.5 or 5 billion, then we could reach 20 times more number of children and adolescents. Then we could end this global learning crisis for children affected by conflict, climate disasters, and forced displacement. Everything boils down to funding. How is it possible? Because we use the humanitarian development nexus. Education is a development sector, yes, but when you use humanitarian access, you go to a country like Central African Republic, where you really don't have a government control over large portions of the territory. You have to apply humanitarian principles of negotiating access, of having UN security guaranteeing your access, and the government, and so forth, or the militia. When you do that, you can reach those left furthest behind. If you apply a combination of humanitarian and development principles. And this is why the strength of the UN is precisely that. We have the humanitarian coordinator, and the resident coordinator working often with one hat or two hats on one person, but with a whole country team and a humanitarian country team. It's about the funding. Give us 10 times more, we can reach 200 million. It's about funding because it costs money to educate a child. The structure, the coordination, the brilliance and competency of UN agencies, civil society, the willingness of most host governments, except maybe one or two, to deliver education to the children, because it's not such a political issue, at least it doesn't seem to. Of course, we would like the whole population to read and write and think critically. But it's an easy commodity and life-saving and necessity to build a country that we can deliver, provided we had the funding. Everything else is in place, as this report is an evidence of.
Thanks. Pam Fogg?
Thank you so much for the report. It's Pamela Fogg from CBS News.
Hi.
Welcome back. You've given us the big picture. Can you give a few examples of reaching children in conflict zones? And how do you get into wartime zones or difficult to reach? So at one point, there were drops by drones of UNICEF of food. Can you do that with education packets? And so how are you reaching, for example, Ukraine or parts of Afghanistan that allow it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very important. Good to see you, Pamela. And all of us. I think we met before as well. Let me say this. Let's start with Sudan. And I'll take the challenges first, and then I'll bring the hope. Take Sudan now. Every humanitarian and development actor in Sudan, I used to work there for United Nations Development Program, so there's a mix of humanitarian and development actors. All are now constrained in to actually operate in the areas of active armed conflict. I mean, operations have moved to Port Sudan and Darfur and South Kordofan and other areas where you have, and Khartoum, of course, where you have an active fighting, and we have had UN staff and, of course, a huge number of civilians who have been murdered by airstrikes or by shootings and killings and executions. It is difficult for everyone to deliver. Everyone, whether it's in the education sector, water sanitation, or food, it's difficult. But one thing that I have learned over my years with working for the UN in many crisis countries, you are in an abnormal situation and you have to develop extraordinary solutions. So all our colleagues who are out there working now, out of necessity, will find ways of managing to deliver, whether it's food drops or finding, moving operations to Port Sudan to cater to the internally displaced, or negotiating access with the warring parties. But to deliver a proper education, right now in Sudan, in the warring, in the high-intensity conflict areas, is not possible. And in parts of Darfur, it wasn't even possible before the outbreak, because, as we know, there were militia groups roaming around there. And I met with refugees in Chad who had stopped going to school even before the war broke out, because their parents did not dare to send them to school for fear that they would be abducted or attacked by militia in Darfur. So it is very, very difficult.
Just to follow up on that point, do you deliver some of these programs to the Chad refugee areas?
Yes, a very good follow-up question. So in Education Cannot Wait, we have two windows. So one is the emergency response window, which has more of the humanitarian, quickly, fast response, and I'll come back to Sudan on that. And then we have the multi-year resilience program, where you can keep going either across the country where you have a severe crisis and those left furthest behind, or in areas. So for instance, in Afghanistan, we have a multi-year resilience program, and that's the positive side of it in the midst of that darkness, is that through our partners on the ground, which I will not mention, we are still delivering education in certain provinces of Afghanistan. This can be home-based schools, or these can be locally negotiated agreements with local commanders. And I'd like to point out, and I've been to Afghanistan many times, including having informal talks with the de facto government, there are those who want to see their daughters to go to school. There's no uniform opinion on that, though there is a categorical ban. So there are places where girls are receiving education, whether at home or otherwise in hiding in Afghanistan, and we will continue because that's part of our mandate and the basis of human rights. In Sudan, we moved very fast with our first emergency response because you had refugees fleeing to 5 key countries across the border: South Sudan, CAR, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Chad. And we moved very quickly, collaborated with UNHCR since they had the primary responsibility for coordinating refugee responses, and that includes education. So we use UNHCR as the main coordinator for that, and worked with them. That's when I went to the border between Chad and Sudan, and where we quickly set up a first emergency response of, $3 million for the newly arriving refugee children, so they could quickly enroll into school, because, again, many of them, I would say almost 99% of those I saw, were severely traumatized. It was absolutely clear they needed mental health, psychosocial services, water, of course, food, and all of that, and also to be brought back into some sense of normalcy. So we worked closely, and we allocated $5 million to UNHCR and partners that they work with, national non-governmental organizations, with the support of the Chadian government giving us security. So these are one example of how we moved fast and how it is possible. In Ukraine, we work closely, again, here with UNICEF, Save the Children, with Their Word, another non-governmental organization chaired by Justin Van Fleet and Sarah Brown, and also the Global Business Coalition that works with them. And they have been so generous through the Global Business Coalition and allocated about $33 million to Education Cannot Wait so far, out of a pledge of $50 million just a few months ago at our high-level conference, in hardware of computer and programming, so that Ukrainian children can continue their learning through remote learning. And we have a very close collaboration with the Minister of Education in Ukraine. So it's possible also because of the infrastructure in Ukraine and neighboring countries. We have also made an investment in Moldova, since Moldova is not a member of the EU. So we went there, the United Kingdom, USAID, FCDO, USAID, and Education Cannot Wait, and civil society. We went together also with UNICEF and UNHCR to implement for invest in refugee children in Moldova. So it is possible, but I wouldn't put, for children living in the Sahel, remote learning is not going to be the answer because they don't have the infrastructure. It's something that COVID showed us was the enormous socioeconomic inequity in terms of infrastructure, access to basic services, and broader development overall. Sitting in the desert-like landscape of Chad or Mali is very different when you don't even have access to Wi-Fi than sitting elsewhere where you can do remote learning. So we have to be very mindful of the huge socioeconomic differences. But there are ways, and we learned during COVID, we were able to support almost 32 million children and adolescents through remote learning, either technology, as I just described, or like in Afghanistan, through teachers going from door to door, picking up the homework, leaving them their assignments. We found all radio programs, all sorts of creative. I say creativity in situations like this, again, comes out of necessity. It's not something you sit and figure out at headquarters. It's when they stand there right in front of you, and you know it's a matter of life or death. Suddenly, you find a solution. Not always, but it's usually the way our colleagues on the ground work often. And it turns out to be life-saving.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ephraim Kusaivi?
Thanks so much, Farhan. Ms. Sherif, I have one question and two follow-up. I actually have more questions, but if we get around to, I'll ask the rest. You mentioned the importance of humanitarian access and respecting humanitarian principles, but we're seeing a trend worldwide right now where humanitarian access is being weaponized by many different repressive regimes, and we're seeing this trend continuing to pick up pace these days. How is that affecting your work, and what kind of, to quote you, extraordinary solutions can be found in an environment like this? This is my main question. Quick follow-up on Sudan. Have you been to other places other than Chad, the other 4 countries? And can you tell a little bit more about what's happening in Ethiopia, Egypt, and what's the difference between these places? And if you have time, will you please tell us something about the Al-Hol and Al-Rukban camps in Syria? Have you been able to access those camps and see what the situation of children is there? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, as I said, humanitarian access is primarily, it has to be a physical access so that you are able to be there and deliver in person. As we know, often when you have a very high intensity conflict, the ones that carry the heaviest burden are the communities and the national staff, when international staff will have to withdraw due to the security. So that is often the case, is that national staff and communities shoulder the biggest burden. But most often, of course, also access is being negotiated. And again, I want to come back to Afghanistan, where access is being negotiated, because you have built strong relations over maybe 20, 30 years in Afghanistan in those particular areas. We have many organizations that have been in Afghanistan for decades. I actually did my first mission with the UN there in 1990, and many of those organizations are still working there. So you can always find, often when you're out there, it also depends a little bit on who you're talking with and how you connect with them and their commanders. So that's one thing. And when you can't negotiate access, if it's totally impossible, yeah, you have to use airdrops. You have to use other ways of transporting. We've seen the whole issue about access between Turkey and Syria that is being examined by the Security Council, I think once a year. How important it is to have a Security Council resolution, which is legally binding law, at times if you cannot negotiate it, based on in-country partnerships or trust, then you need to use international law and go that route. So there are different ways of doing that. In Syria, we have worked, and we continue to work very much with local national NGOs and UN agencies who are in Syria. So wherever they have access, we have access. If they have access to the various camps, including the one you mentioned, then we will have access there as well. We are not an operational partner. We are a pooled funding mechanism in the UN system for education and the related sectors. But wherever the UN or NGOs, civil society can go, there we can go. And this means that we don't always rely on the government itself. When you have, as I said, CAR, or you have Yemen, where you have de facto the Euro government, when you have different parties that control different territories, government access may not take you all the way. Then you need to negotiate access with the groups who control the territory. And that's precisely what our colleagues on the ground, NGOs or the UN, do. Yes, Education Cannot Wait has conducted missions to all the 4 out of 5 countries affected by the Sudan conflict. We had a mission to Central African Republic. The biggest challenge there is that the refugees, children and adolescents coming from Sudan speak Arabic and English, and in Central African Republic, it's French. So we have a language barrier, which is not uncommon for refugees, but in this particular refugee setting, it is one big barrier that can be overcome, of course, and will be overcome, is that refugee children arriving not being French-speaking. In Ethiopia, before the Sudan conflict broke out, we also had the Tigray and that whole issue. So we have been heavily invested there, both through a multi-year program and through first emergency response. And we just released, I think it was 2 million just a couple of weeks ago, in addition for the refugees crossing into Ethiopia. So we have long investments in Ethiopia and conducting several missions there. And South Sudan, yes, I was out there recently because we launched our second multi-year investment with the Minister of Education and the President of South Sudan, where we have made huge strides in a very young country where I visited for the first time, I think in '97, and I saw only one school building. And today, of course, a lot of progress has been made in terms of building schools and good learning outcomes. However, it is a big country and it's very young, and more funding is needed. We have a big multi-year investment now of where we have put in $30 million, the Global Partnership for Education, $10 million, and we need an additional $10 million, and we will have a fully funded program for South Sudan. I think it is, yes. And then for Egypt, the situation is slightly different there, having discussed this at length with UNHCR colleagues, is that many of the refugees there don't stay at the border or in refugee settings, but they start moving towards Cairo and integrate in order also to get registered. But we are making a first emergency response of 2 million there. So we are responding to all 5 refugee receiving countries, as well as a first emergency response to Sudan itself and our colleagues who are working in country.
Yes, one more.
Sorry, I'm abusing this. Last year you told us we were talking about Afghanistan, and you mentioned that there are 2 kinds of Taliban. There are those who are very strict, they're adamant about not letting women get their education, and there are those who are more moderate and we can talk to more. But we are not seeing any difference really 1 year or 2 years later. Do you still believe that there is a force within the Taliban that could make things change on the ground for women and girls? And what's your view on what's happening right now in the country in terms of education for girls and women? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I would like to refer to the UN's Special Envoy for Global Education, who has been driving this campaign for girls' education in Afghanistan. And we worked very closely around the matter, and I've also been out there meeting with colleagues and informal meetings with the de facto government. And so has, of course, our esteemed Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, who led an all-women mission also to Afghanistan. Well, I can only speak from my experiences of having lived and worked in the country. I think we need to bear in mind, first of all, and no blame. Afghans are very strongly independent, fiercely independent people, and they have been so throughout history. So we can't take away that from them, and that obviously lives on, that sense of independence. When it comes to the Taliban, I can only say that I have met those who want to see their daughters go back to school genuinely, who are frustrated, who wants to see a change. I'm not saying that they do not agree with other aspects of the Taliban policy, and it's not my business. My business is the right to education for girls and boys. And I do know that this is the ban is not shared by many of them. And I think it's important to bear in mind also that the Taliban, some of them were former mujahideen, whose daughters went to school. Some were refugees in Pakistan. Some never left Afghanistan. There are, difference of opinion everywhere, but obviously there is an official opinion right now that contravenes the UN Charter and international human rights. And much of the great, I would say, advancements that have been made in Afghanistan, not just over the past 20 years, for centuries. Afghanistan was a very, very forward-looking country prior to the invasion, end of the 70s. I think the war started there and not 20 years ago. So just to bear that in mind. But I cannot. I think what will be important is that the international community, of course, United Nations is very strong on this, and that countries that have any influence exercise that political leverage to bring about the change. We must remember also that the majority of the Afghan people have suffered enormously. The entire population from famine, climate-induced disasters, armed conflict, extreme poverty since the late 70s. And we're speaking about the whole population that is on the brink of collapsing as human beings. And to rebuild all of that, you need 50% of the population, the women. Afghan women are strong. Yes, give them the education that they so deserve. And they will work hand in hand with their brothers and their fathers and their husbands and rebuild that country.
And on that optimistic note, I'd like to thank once again our guest, Yasmine Sherif, the Executive Director of Education Cannot Wait. Thank you very much for your briefing. And for you in the room, please stay on for Monica Villela Graley, who is returning in her capacity as spokesperson for the President of the General Assembly.
Thank you.
That's copies of the report.
You make